All right, we will get started today. We're in Revelation 1. We started with the prologue last week. When we get to the big sections, we're about to read a vision. And when we read the visions, we should read them in a whole together so that we can see the whole thing and then we can break it down. So what we'll do is I'll read the first whole section and then we'll go back and reread and study it together. So, starting in verse 9, this is what we read here. I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. On the Lord's day, I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet, which said, "Write on a scroll what you see, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea." I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me, and when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were blazing like fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp, double-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in all of its brilliance. And when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. And then he placed his right hand on me and said, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades. Write therefore what you have seen, what is now, and what will take place later. The mystery of the 7 stars you saw on my right hand and the 7 golden lampstands is this. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. All right. So that's the big thing. Since I just read it, we'll just not read verse 9. We'll just jump into it. So verse 9, we see that this is the beginning of the letter proper. So we had an introduction in verses 1 through 8, and now here's the letter John is communicating. John introduces himself. How does he introduce himself? Yeah, brother and fellow partaker or companion. Same concept. What'd you say? Yeah, mine says companion. The fellow, it's the same word, just depending on how we want to take it. Okay, compadre or comrade. There we go. That's a better one. The connection that he has with his readers is the connection that he has with Jesus. What is it that they are companions and brothers in? Yeah, suffering. There's actually 3 things here: in suffering, in the kingdom, and in perseverance. Okay. Yep, patient endurance. Yep, perseverance. All the same thing. Okay. The structure of the Greek here suggests that these are one thing, not 3 separate things. All right. So if you want one, you have to have all 3. Okay. So if you want the kingdom, it means that you're going to have suffering, and you're going to have perseverance, which is exciting, right? Ironically, this does fit the rest of what we're going to read in the book. If we think about Jesus, we need to recognize that the way that Christ conquers is by his suffering, perseverance, and now he reigns forever in the kingdom, right? Jesus doesn't just get the kingdom, he earns it by his suffering and perseverance. Similarly, what we're going to see over and over again is that the saints, Christians, are encouraged to suffer and patiently suffer so that you can have the kingdom's rewards. That's what we're going to see. John is on the island of Patmos, he tells us, because of his witness of Jesus. We'll talk about that in a second. This map here does not label Patmos. Patmos is one of these tiny islands in this area here. So somewhere in this area, very insignificant rock, used in first century Rome for exiles to send them to. And so that's kind of what he's there for. He is suffering because of the witness, which is probably his witness of Jesus. All right, so him spreading the gospel has caused him to be in this situation. So he is a fellow partaker in suffering because of where he's at, right? All right, let's reread verses 10 through 11. And someone that feels comfortable with names.
I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like the sound of a trumpet. Write in a book what you see and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, and to Smyrna, and to Pergamum, and to Thyatira, and to Sardis, and to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea.
All right, so he tells us he's on the Lord's Day. What's the Lord's Day? Sunday, okay. It could be used in other ways, but Sunday is the most likely reference. Starting from about midway through the first century, they started calling Sunday the Lord's Day in reference to Jesus' resurrection, right? This is the day that Jesus rose. It's the day we celebrate. It's why we meet on Sunday for church, is because we're remembering Jesus' resurrection. So that's where he's at. We do have echoes here of Ezekiel's rapture in the Spirit in this book, and this is one of them. I was in the Spirit. We're going to see that a little bit later, that he's going to be, in chapter 4, he's going to be taken up to heaven in the Spirit. And so that's just something Ezekiel did quite often. And basically what John's trying to do is connect his letter to Old Testament prophecy, and we're going to see that, especially in the next couple of chapters, definitely. So we do see this here. We are told that a trumpet or a voice like a trumpet sounds. Where else in the Bible do we hear a voice like a trumpet? Anybody?
I've heard it because last year, or 2 or 3 years ago, they were trying to say trumpet and Trump. And
Oh, no. All right. So when the Israelites came out of Egypt, they went to Mount Sinai, and one of the things that happens is God speaks to the Israelites, and their response is, "Moses, you go for us, because we don't want to listen to this," right? And when we read that passage, we should be reminded that voice that spoke was like a trumpet. And so we should be reminded of Sinai here, all right? And one of the things that you're going to see, especially when we look at the vision of Jesus, is that Jesus takes on a lot of God, okay? So Jesus is going to be equated with Yahweh, okay? And we're going to see that played out. And so don't let anybody ever say that nowhere in the New Testament is Jesus called God, because while he may not actually be called God, he is equated with God over and over and over again. Okay, so the divinity of Jesus is very much in the New Testament, and we read it even here. And does John ever say that Jesus is God? No, but he's saying that he is with what he's communicating. All right, so this is one of those ways. He also tells them to write on a scroll. Is anybody else told to write on a scroll?
Moses?
Isaiah.
Pretty much all the Old Testament prophets are at some point in time told to write on a scroll. So generally, if we're paying attention, anytime they're told to write on a scroll, it's usually a prophecy of judgment. Okay? So Isaiah definitely is told to write on a scroll. Jeremiah is told to write on a scroll. He takes it to the king, and the king cuts it up and burns it, right? And so God says, okay, rewrite on a scroll and add this. And so we actually have samples of Jeremiah where it's shorter than others. And we're like, why is that happening? Well, probably because the king cut it up and burned it. And so Jeremiah was told to write a longer one. Just kind of an interesting factoid there. But anytime there is a scroll in Old Testament prophecy, it usually is judgments. You're writing it, and it's a judgment. Okay, so if we're paying real close attention, whatever we're about to read, we should in the back of our minds think judgment. Okay, so Revelation is a prophecy of judgment, if you didn't know that already, right? We come into this having read it maybe a little bit, or hearing people talk about it. All right, then he tells him to write to who? The 7 churches, and he lists them, right? All these churches are in Asia, or what we would call Asia Minor. If I say Asia, I mean Asia Minor. The province of Asia is actually just kind of this area right here, and then there's other provinces. And so this is the area, and this map maker was nice enough to list them all for us. They are Ephesus, which is right here, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Basically, we can ask why this order, and the answer is it makes it a circle, okay? And so if this is one letter being written and being sent to the churches, one person would go from Patmos to Ephesus, which is a port city, the natural starting location for this. And then if he follows the road, these are the towns in which he would come to as he went along the road, okay? So if you were writing a letter from Vandalia to Colombia, you could say, tell the churches in Mexico, Centralia, Hallsville, Colombia. And it's just the natural way that it goes, right? So that's it. We can ask the question, why these 7 churches? And we've talked a little bit about this. Some people would argue that what we should be reading are successive church ages, and so then you have the Ephesians church, and then so on and so forth. There's lots of problems with that, but this is one that way to read it. Another, it could be that these churches are ones that recognize John's prophetic ability, which probably is definitely true. John, the Apostle John, lived in the town of Ephesus, and so he would have been in his first, second, and third John are probably written to churches in this area, and so maybe it's the churches that recognize him. That's a possibility. More likely, though, is that they probably are the centers of postal trade in the region. Okay, so they didn't have. Well, you can think of it like our post office today, right? You mail a letter, it goes to the Mexico post office, and then it goes to Colombia before it goes spread out, right? And so think of this as Colombia. These cities are Colombia. So if you're wanting to also reach the smaller towns, you would need to first go to these cities first. And so it's possible that that's it. Really, it's probably that they are representatives of the entire church. I put a question mark here because we're just not quite sure exactly, but 7 is the number of perfection, completion. And so we should think of these 7 churches are just representatives of the situation of the churches at large. And I think we will be able to read in chapters 2 and 3 those situations and recognize even in our own history that we see churches like this or that. Okay, so there's something that we can all learn. No, it doesn't matter if we're in Ephesus or Laodicea. We can learn from these letters that are going to be written. Okay, all right.
Were they all started by the Apostle Paul?
Not that we know of. Paul, really, of these churches, I think Paul's in Ephesus. Yeah. He might have started Smyrna and Pergamum. I'll just look at the colors here. So Ephesus, maybe Smyrna and Pergamum, but for sure, like, not necessarily. Smyrna, and that's where I'm at, is I don't think he actually, he never went to Thyatira, Sardis, or Philadelphia as far as we know. And this one is just a guess on how he did. There's a road that travels here, and it says that he went overland, and so our assumption is that he went on the major road, but he could have come down through here too, so we're just not quite sure. The only one I know for sure is Ephesus. And he actually didn't start it, but he came and supported it. So.
That's where the elders came out.
Yeah, Miletus, but he was also there for 2 years in Ephesus, and he left Priscilla and Aquila. Like, they visited Ephesus, and he said, "Hey, this would be great," and then he went on to Jerusalem, and Priscilla and Aquila stayed there. So I would say that they're more the founders than Paul was, and Apollos was there. That's where Priscilla and Aquila met Apollos. So, So that'd be my answer. I would say I don't think so, but I also don't know who else. All right, let's read 12 through 16. It's a bigger passage.
I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me, and when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp, double-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in all its brilliance.
All right, what we have in the rest of this chapter is a typical formula in prophecy. It is, he gets a vision, we have a reaction, and then we have an interpretation. And so we see this, especially in Daniel. You'll see it in Daniel quite a bit, the vision, the reaction, interpretation. So if you read Daniel 2, you have that. If you read Daniel 7, you have that. Daniel 8 and 9 has it as well. We see it in other prophets as well. And so again, John is, if we're paying attention, John is very much aligning his book with Old Testament prophecy. All right, he's saying, I'm in a line with these people in the past. So let's talk about the individual parts and try to interpret them. And to do that, we have to look at Old Testament stuff. So bear with me on this. First thing that he sees is 7 golden lampstands. In the Old Testament, the lampstands first appear in Exodus 25, 37, and Numbers 8. They are in association with the tabernacle. But this specific image probably comes from Zechariah 4, 2 through 10, in which the 7 lampstands represent the spirits of God. In Zechariah, in particular, the 7 powers of God, we'll see in a little bit that the lampstands we're told at the end of this chapter represent the churches, okay? And so, but that doesn't necessarily misalign, right? Because what does the Spirit do for the church? What does the Holy Spirit do for the church? Okay, I'll give you 2 words. It indwells and empowers. And everything that you say probably falls under those 2 things, right? Indwells and empowers. And so even though Zechariah is associated with the Spirit of God and John does with the churches, one thing you'll see in chapter 4 is that the lampstands before God represent the spirits of God. And so they're kind of intermixed. And so we should read it as the churches that are indwelled and empowered by the Spirit. Okay? So that's what I think we should read this in particular. 7 lamps, yes, but they're indwelled and empowered by the Spirit of God, which is an encouragement if we think about it, right? We have the Spirit of God indwelling us and empowering us, causing us to move forward. The next thing he sees is what? Yeah, someone like the Son of Man among the lampstands. And it's important that we understand that. He's among the lampstand. Where do we see Son of Man? Someone like the Son of Man in the Old Testament? Yep. We see, I don't know if it says it there, but for sure we see it in Daniel 2, 7, and 10. If we look at the burning furnace, there's someone else in there with them, but I forget how he's described. So
The vegetable version described it as someone really shiny.
Right. Well, they're all in fires, not being consumed, so they'd all be shiny. Daniel 2, 7, and 10 talk about the Son of Man in particular. And again, the fact that he's among the lampstand should tell us that this person is among the churches, right? If the lampstands are the churches and this one is among the lampstands, then Jesus is among the churches. So this, again, is encouraging for churches especially that are suffering, facing persecution, because they're not facing it alone, right? Instead, you have the Son of Man, Jesus, amongst us. He's with us. He is present with us. And that's kind of going to be the encouragement throughout the rest of the book. He is dressed in robes of white with a golden sash. In the Old Testament, who dressed in white with golden sashes? The priests. Good job. Yeah, kings not necessarily, but priests for sure. So he's dressed as a priest here. One of the jobs of the priest is to go in and trim the lamps, right? So in the tabernacle, the priest went in there. They made sure there was oil. They trimmed back the wick. If a lampstand had gone out, they would relight it. And so Jesus, as a priest, as our high priest, is living amongst the churches, trimming us and taking care of us and making sure things are well with us. That's what we should imagine when we read this passage here. His hair is white. There's one person in particular that says to have white hair. Anybody know that in the Old Testament? Besides them. Interestingly, in Daniel chapter 7, verse 9, he says the Ancient of Days has white hair. Now, who's the Ancient of Days? Yes. God. Okay? So in that Daniel 7 passage, he says, I saw the Ancient of Days, and then he gives power and sovereignty to the Son of Man, or to one like the Son of Man. All right, so they are two separate things in Daniel. But yeah, we're seeing a couple of things here already, right? What was the first thing we saw that he's equated? Oh, the voice of a trumpet, right? PH? Trumpet. I always want to put a PH there. And now we have hair of white. So in case we miss it, like Jesus is being equated with God. Okay, he is God. He has divinity. And we should see it in this fact as well. What are his feet and eyes like? Yeah, they're blazing. Okay. This comes from Daniel 10:2, probably. Or Daniel 10:6, sorry. Daniel 10:6. And they probably are a reflection of Jesus' purity. Okay, so fire is a purifying element. And so when we have fire representative, it's usually done for purity reasons. So Jesus is purity. His eyes, what he sees is pure. What his feet is pure. His whole face shines, and we'll talk about that in a second. And so the fact that Jesus is pure allows him to have the ability to demand purity in front of him. And so what we're going to see is him constantly challenging the churches to overcome their sins and be pure so that he can present a bride pure and holy, right? So and that comes from the fact that he himself is pure, both in what he does and what he sees. What's he holding in his hands? Yeah, 7 stars are in his hands. We are told that those are the 7 angels, okay? Daniel 12:3 has the stars representing the wise in Israel, okay? And Revelation, we're told that they represent the angels, okay? We'll discuss that more in detail. For now, we should realize that lampstands and stars are representative of God's people, both on earth as well as in heaven. So we have the stars as representatives in heaven. And that corresponds with what's happening on earth. And so that's kind of important. What happens in earth and above, they are connected, interconnected. And these angels are going to be responsible for the churches. We have some of that even in our own lives, as far as when you read passages like elders have to be careful because they'll be held accountable for the things that they say and do, right? And teachers the same way. Anything that's taught will be held accountable. It's because what we do on earth reflects in heaven, and there's a interconnection there. And so we should kind of read that somewhat here. Then we have this divine warrior image, right? Like Jesus has a sword protruding from his mouth. face like a son. Like swords, they're not used for chopping wood, usually. Do you use a sword to chop wood? No. I mean, the sword's used for battle, right? You don't use it for cooking, right? It's used for battle. And so when we see a sword, we should think battle. And so there's definitely a divine warrior image here with that sword coming out of his mouth. Isaiah 11:4 talks about it. 49:2 talks about it. Generally, in the divine warrior image, it's also a judgment issue. And so here we see Jesus as judge with the sword coming from his mouth. He also has a face like the sun, which again is a divine warrior image. That comes from Daniel 10 and Judges 5:31. So what we see is that Christ is going to come and do battle, right? And the battle that is done is judgment. And so throughout this whole passage, we see that in the first chapter so far, we see that Jesus has been presented both as king, priest, and judge. And those are interworking together. All right, verse 17 through 18. Let's see John's response to all of that.
When I saw him, I fell at his feet like a dead man, and he placed his right hand on me, saying, Do not be afraid, I am the first and the last, and the living one, and I was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and of Hades.
All right. What's John's response? Fell down in fear, right? This is, of course, a typical response, and one of the common rephrases is what? Well, woe is me. What is the common, when people fall down before the person that they fall down to usually says, yeah, don't be afraid, fear not, right? And so that's what John's essentially told here. Don't be afraid. Yeah, well, I mean, like Sarah said, woe is me. I mean, that was Isaiah when he saw the Ancient of Days. Woe is me, I am a man of unclean lips and among a people of unclean lips, right? Woe is me. And so that's John's response. Jesus tells him not to be afraid. Don't be afraid. Again, common in scriptures. But I think we should extend this to the readers, okay? Because what Jesus says next would be encouragement to every one of the 7 churches, right? And he says, I am the first and the last. I am the one that I'm living, continually living. I was dead, but now I'm alive. I hold the keys to death and Hades. Okay, and so Jesus is in control. And if God is in control of history, what should our response be? Yeah, praise. Our response should be we should not be afraid. I think Hebrews 13:5 and 6 says, be content in everything that you have. And, verse 6 says, let me just get to verse 6. That's the one that matters. It says, I should not be afraid. What can mere man do to me? Right? And that is something that we should take to heart here. Jesus says, do not be afraid of man who can kill your body, but cannot touch your soul. Instead, fear the one who can kill both body and soul. And I think that's what we should see here is do not be afraid. I am in control, and we have encouragement of this. So the first words of Jesus is encouragement. I am in control. We're in a win-win, right? And it's going to be tough. It's not necessarily easy, but he is in control. And the reason he's in control is because he has the keys of death and Hades. And there's those verses I was talking about. And so even if we die, we know that we shall live. And that is encouragement to not be afraid of this world, but to continue to be faithful, not to compromise, to try to escape death, because we all die. What happens after that first death is what matters.
Who's the equivalent of?
Okay. What do you mean by that question?
Why are they different all the time?
Okay. So hell, as we usually picture it, we picture it as the final resting place for things. That hasn't happened yet. And there is a lake of fire that everybody's cast to at the end, but that's not where everybody's at now. Hades, generally in the New Testament, is the resting place of the dead. as they're waiting for judgment. And so that's where I would kind of place it.
So are any of like past Jews that are saved, are they in Hades?
So in what passage? 1 Corinthians? I want to say 1 Corinthians, maybe 2 Corinthians. It says that Jesus took captivity captive. And generally we say that he went to Hades and brought up the saved. Generally. Now exactly how that all works out, I don't know. It's not clearly defined. I don't know that I know Gareth Reese has a certain view. I don't know that I agree with him, for those that know his view. I don't know what it looks like. On quite a few things. Love the man to death. Great man. I disagree with him on several things. So I just don't vocalize it all the time. So and he might have changed. Yeah. And he knows what he believes, and I just not always on the same page. Not that he's bad or anything. So continue to read his books all you want. So yeah. And I might change to be with him. He's been around for 93 years, we found out this morning. So I might change in 93 years. So, all right. That'd be my answer to that, Caleb. So, all right. So one is talking about the place where dead are now compared to where the eternal place is. So, all right, verses 19 through 20.
Therefore write the things which you have seen, and the things that are, the things which will take place after these things. As for the mystery of the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches.
All right. The opening visions begins with a recommission to write to the 7 churches, very similar to verse 11 that we just read, almost identical in some of the wording. We do have to ask, what does 119 mean for the rest of the book? We've talked a little bit about this. Is it mean that everything that takes place after 119 is chronological, talking about what's going to happen for the rest of eternity until Jesus returns? The problem I have with that is that it relegates most of the book's message away from the original audience, and it doesn't feel right to me. If this is a letter, it has to mean something to them, and so they need to have encouragement from it. And so I would argue against that. Rather, I think 119 does have connections to Daniel 2 and is used as a literary hinge to introduce a new topic. All right, and so we have a new topic, which are going to be the letters, in which we'll see. Basically, when we get to the letters in chapters 2 through 3, everything that we've just read of this vision of Jesus are brought back. And so if we remember the vision of Jesus, then we can understand the encouragement that's going to be given in chapters 2 through 3 to each of the churches. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. And so what I would say is the book is about to start, right? So we had a literary hinge in verse 1 as an introduction. Now we have one in verse 19, so the book is about to start. We'll have one in 4:1, and then we'll have one in like 22:13 or something like that. We do get some interpretation of the vision that has just been seen. In particular, the 7 lampstands are the churches, all right, and the 7 stars are the angels. In Daniel, angels play a role in the heavenly realms very similar to those that they represent. And so when you read Daniel, we have this idea of the archangel Michael is waging war against different things, and the different angels that represent the different kingdoms are doing different things. So if you read that passage, it seems kind of weird, but it's this interconnection of what is happening on earth is also happening within a spiritual realm. And so we really are in a spiritual warfare, and it's related to what's happening on earth. Okay. Some of the responsibility is shared by the heavenly agents for the actions of the earthly trusts, meaning that what we do, the angels are responsible for, and vice versa. So we should view this to mean that we have both the earthly church in mind as well as a heavenly church or a spiritual church taking place. And so when we talk about the 7 churches, it should be in our minds the universal church, because yes, they are physical, real churches that no longer exist, but they also are this spiritual church, this universal church that's taking place in the heavenly realms as well. So we should read this as universal church. All right, so that's chapter 1. What do we learn from chapter 1?
Jesus is God.
Okay, Jesus is God. We can see that. Yep. What else?
A description of what he looks like.
Okay. I don't know that that's exactly what Jesus looks like. It's a vision designed to give us understanding of who Jesus is.
He is in control.
He's in control. Okay.
If we want the kingdom, we're gonna have to do the suffering.
Yeah, if we get the kingdom, we're going to have to do suffering. That's a good point. I think we could break down what we learned to 3 sections. We can talk about the blessings from reading and obeying Revelation from verses 1 to 3. I know we didn't read that today. We can also talk about the basis of God's eternal glory and power and the reason he can pass down his sovereignty to his son in verses 4 through 8. And then we also see that Jesus is king, priest, and judge, something that's going to be important in the rest of the book. Okay, we do have some time, and so we can do an introduction portion to the letters. We won't actually read today, but we need to understand some things that are happening here. So here you can see that circle, right? Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. And there's a road that connects those cities.
Pennsylvania.
Yes, same name. Okay. Means the city of brotherly love. Okay.
Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania has a lot of brotherly love.
All right now.
Everyone answered that for you. Okay, all right. All right, chapters 2 to 3 of Revelation contain 7 messages. I would say they're probably prophetic messages to this individual churches, but they're listed individually but meant to be read collectively. These are things that are happening not just in these churches, but in other churches as well. And so with that in mind, we can recognize the importance to us and we can learn from them. One thing that we'll notice is that the letters are connected to the vision of Jesus in Revelation 1. And so every time that you have a letter, it always talks about Jesus and one of the aspects of Jesus. And so if we remember what the aspect of Jesus is, we can find the encouragement for the church that's being written to. We also see that they have a connection to the visions of Revelation 21 through 22. So at the very end of each of the letters, it says, "To the one who overcomes, I will give." And the thing that is given is mentioned in chapters 21 through 22. 21 and 22 are the visions of the new heaven and the new earth. And so what we can kind of picture is chapters 2 and 3 is the imperfect church on earth. And chapters 21 through 22 are the perfected church in heaven. Perfected, perfected. And instead of in earth, we should say in God's presence. Okay? And so everything that happens in between these is really the way in which that perfection takes place. And we should recognize some of that. There is a literary pattern to the letters. The same 7 things appear over and over again. First, there's a command to write to the angel of a church. So write to the angel of the church in Ephesus. Write to the angel of the church in Smyrna. Write to the angel. You'll see that every time. Then there's a Christ self-description that's derived from chapter 1. And so essentially, like if Ephesus, it says, write to the church in Ephesus, these are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his hand and walks among the 7 lampstands. Self-description. Smyrna has something very similar. Write to the church in Smyrna. Sorry, let me find it here. These are the words of him who's the first and the last, who died and came to life. Those are words of Jesus, right? So everything that we see in chapter 1 is going to come into play in chapters 2 through 3. Then you have a commendation for the church's good works, if any. Okay, so this is one that doesn't always appear, especially when you get to Laodicea. But if there's anything good, that's commended. Then there's an accusation of some sin, if any. There's two churches that are not sinful, all right, or don't have a major sin that Jesus is addressing. And so we'll talk about them. Then there's an exhortation to repent with a warning of judgment and an encouragement. So after you announce what the sin is, he says, stop it. Otherwise, you're going to be judged, or stop it and good things will happen, okay? Then there's an exhortation to discern the truth of the preceding message, all with the same words. He who has ear to hear what the Spirit says to the churches. That's the exhortation. And then there's a promise to the one who is victorious, or to the one who overcomes, or to the one who conquers. All right. So you always have that same thing. With some obvious distinctions depending on who's being talked to. There's also a chiastic structure to the letters, chapters 2 to 3. So you have the letter to the letter to Ephesus, and they are in danger of losing their identity as a church. Then you have a letter to Smyrna, which are a faithful and loyal church in the face of persecution. Then you have 3 letters, letter to Pergamum, to Thyatira, and to Sardis, that are a mixture of faithful and compromising, and each of these get a little less faithful, okay? So Pergamum is the best shape. Sardis is the worst of the shape of these 3 churches, okay? So progressively it gets worse. Then you go back and you have a letter to Philadelphia, who's a faithful and loyal church, okay? And then you have the letter to Laodicea, which are also in danger of losing their identity. This is done on purpose, all right? We have chiastic structures throughout the Bible. It's a very Hebrew thing to do. Anytime you have a chiastic structure, what's the most important part of it? The middle, the center point. Okay, in this case, it's C. Okay, and in this case, we have 3 of them, right? And that's all. That's still all 3 of them are the middle points. And so, what we should get from this is that, in general, this is the state of the church. Universal. You will have some faithful churches. You'll have You'll have some churches that are not faithful, but most of the churches are a mixture of faithfulness and compromising. And I think you'll see that. Take any church in history, and you'll generally see that to be the case. Okay, we have a mixture of people that are compromising their faith, and a mixture of people that are extremely faithful, and there's a message there to be heard. Okay, all right. I am going to stop there. We are ready to jump into the letter, but time runs short. So we'll probably get through most of the letters of chapter 2 next week, but don't hold me to that.